The lights are on. Security patrols the perimeter, radios crackling in the tropical night. Kitchen crews arrive before dawn to prep stations gleaming under industrial fluorescence. Pool filters hum through their cycles. Laundry machines never stop. The resort operates. Staff uniforms stay crisp. Restaurants open at posted hours. Occupancy hovers at respectable levels, far from empty. The property functions exactly as designed. And yet, every single day, it loses money. If a resort can operate flawlessly, serve hundreds of guests, and maintain 5-star standards, why does it still bleed cash until someone finally admits the truth? From the outside, everything appeared to work. The ribbon cutting drew local officials and photographers who captured the moment in soft focus. The resort stretched along the coastline like a statement rendered in concrete and glass. Multiple wings housed hundreds of rooms. Landscaping framed the approach with palms and flowering shrubs positioned to suggest effortless tropical abundance. Guests arrived that first week with luggage and expectations. Check-in was smooth. Rooms revealed ocean views through floor-to-ceiling windows. Everything felt ready, polished, complete. The restaurants filled during dinner service. The main pool, lit from beneath, glowed aquamarine against the evening sky. A bar at the shallow end served cocktails to guests who watched the horizon. By most visible measures, the resort succeeded. Rooms were booked, services functioned. Guests left positive reviews. The property generated exactly the atmosphere it promised. Exclusive, comfortable, seamlessly managed. Revenue began to flow. Room rates commanded premium pricing. The spa booked appointments. Conference facilities hosted corporate retreats. Food and beverage operations turned consistent sales. Every department reported activity. Weekly revenue figures climbed into 6 digits. Monthly totals reached 7. The property was producing income. It looked like a functioning business. But underneath the surface activity, a different equation was already forming. The resort had been designed to break even, and the number required to reach that threshold was far higher than anyone standing at the ribbon cutting would have guessed. The question wasn't whether the resort could function. It already did. The question was whether it could ever generate enough revenue to cover what it cost to exist. This wasn't designed to compete. It was designed to dominate. The developers understood that resort markets operated on tiers. At the top of the market, competition worked differently. Iconic resorts competed on scarcity, on the perception that staying here meant something. To capture that segment, the resort couldn't simply be nice. It had to be extraordinary. The architecture made statements, soaring lobbies with water features visible from multiple floors, stone imported from specific quarries, fixtures custom fabricated to match the design vision. No detail was too small if it contributed to the impression that this place was different, special, worth the premium. The amenities list grew during planning. Multiple pools, a full-service spa, fitness facilities that rivaled dedicated gyms, tennis courts maintained to professional standards, beach access managed by dedicated staff. Food and beverage operations were conceived as destinations. The signature restaurant needed a chef with name recognition. Wine cellars stocked with bottles meant to impress collectors. Guest rooms exceeded industry norms. Generous square footage. Bathrooms with separate showers and soaking tubs. Technology integrated seamlessly. The goal was to make every room feel like an upgrade. Service standards were set high deliberately. Staffing ratios ensured guests rarely waited. Training programs drilled consistency. The experience was engineered to feel personalized, attentive, anticipatory. All of this required scale. The resort opened with 427 rooms across 4 wings. By comparison, most successful luxury properties operated with 150 to 250 rooms, but the development team calculated that fewer rooms would limit revenue potential. That calculation made sense in isolation. More rooms meant more potential revenue, but it also meant more cost, more infrastructure, more complexity. The scale that was supposed to ensure success simultaneously created the conditions that made success nearly impossible. Because building an iconic resort meant building something that demanded constant, expensive perfection. And perfection at this scale came with a price that had nothing to do with quality or management. It came down to simple arithmetic. Every resort has a number it must reach just to survive. Break-even is not profit. It's the point where revenue exactly matches costs. Nothing accumulates, nothing is lost. The operation sustains itself without subsidy, without sliding deeper into deficit. For most businesses, break-even sits somewhere below full capacity. A restaurant might break even at 60% of capacity. The margin allows for slow seasons, unexpected repairs, market fluctuations. This resort's break-even calculation started with fixed costs: property taxes, insurance premiums, mortgage costs, utilities for common areas, salaries for essential staff, maintenance contracts, security, landscape upkeep. The fixed costs alone ran into the millions annually. Before a single guest checked in, the resort owed tens of thousands of dollars simply for existing. Variable costs added to the equation: housekeeping supplies, food and beverage costs, laundry expenses, energy usage, commission payments to booking platforms. Revenue came from several streams. Room rates formed the foundation. Food and beverage sales added significant margin. Spa services, activities, and retail contributed smaller but meaningful amounts. The break-even occupancy rate emerged from comparing these figures. How many rooms needed to be filled, at what average rate, generating what level of ancillary spending to cover both fixed and variable costs. The resort's break-even occupancy sat at 78%. That meant 334 of the 427 rooms needed to be occupied every single night, year-round, generating not just base room revenue, but also substantial spending on food, activities, and services. The average daily rate had to hold at premium levels. 78% occupancy is achievable in strong markets during high season, but as an annual average, across every day of the year, including low seasons, holidays, weather events, and inevitable maintenance closures, 78% is extraordinarily difficult to sustain. The resort had never reached it. Not in its best month, not in its strongest year. The highest occupancy ever recorded was 71%, achieved during a single exceptional quarter when multiple factors aligned. That quarter, the resort came closest to breaking even. It still lost money, just less than usual. The gap between 71% and 78% appears small. 7 percentage points, 30 rooms. But those 30 rooms represented the difference between survival and slow failure. The resort never filled that gap. Despite professional management, aggressive marketing, competitive pricing, and excellent service, it never achieved the occupancy level required to break even. The problem wasn't performance. The problem was the number itself. Break-even had been set too high by the resort's fundamental structure. Whether full or empty, the resort paid the same bills. Property taxes arrived on schedule. The assessment was based on the resort's appraised value: land, buildings, improvements, fixtures. The number was enormous. Every year, the municipality sent an invoice that ran into 7 figures. Insurance premiums reflected risk and replacement cost. Hurricane insurance alone consumed hundreds of thousands annually. Liability coverage required substantial premiums. The policies were necessary. Without them, a single storm or lawsuit could destroy the operation entirely. Debt service dwarfed other fixed costs. The construction had been financed through bonds and loans. The principal and interest payments followed rigid schedules. Lenders didn't accept excuses based on occupancy rates. Miss a payment and default proceedings would begin immediately. Salaries for core staff couldn't fluctuate with occupancy. The general manager, department heads, accounting staff, human resources, maintenance supervisors, security personnel all drew salaries year-round. The payroll for salaried staff ran into millions annually. Utilities for common areas maintained costs independent of occupancy. Lights stayed on. Climate control systems ran continuously. Water circulated through decorative features. The electrical load for common spaces remained constant. Landscape maintenance couldn't be deferred based on guest counts. Palm trees didn't stop growing during slow months. Grass required. Mowing on schedule. The resort's curb appeal was essential to maintaining its market position. Contracts for services were typically annual. Pool maintenance, elevator inspections, fire suppression testing, pest control. These vendors didn't reduce fees when occupancy dropped. Equipment depreciation reflected real economic loss. Kitchen equipment wore out. HVAC systems aged. Furniture degraded. Technology became obsolete. The resort's physical assets declined in value steadily, regardless of use. The combined weight of these fixed costs created a floor beneath which expenses could not fall. During the slowest months, when occupancy dropped to 40%, the fixed costs remained unchanged. The gap between revenue and costs widened into a chasm that no amount of belt-tightening could close. This was the trap built into the resort's structure. High fixed costs created a baseline expense that only extraordinary occupancy could cover. When occupancy fell short, losses accumulated automatically. There was no mechanism to reduce costs proportionally. What made the resort impressive also made it fragile. Scale had been the strategy. Size was supposed to be an advantage, but scale multiplied complexity and cost in ways that smaller properties avoided. 427 rooms meant 427 air conditioning units requiring maintenance. Each unit had filters, coils, condensers, electronic controls. Each could fail. A smaller resort with 150 rooms had 150 units to maintain. The work was proportional, but the logistics were exponentially more complex at larger scale. Housekeeping scaled linearly, but became logistically intricate. A 150-room property might employ 30 housekeepers. This resort needed 90. Managing 90 workers required supervisors, training programs, quality control systems, and HR infrastructure that added overhead. Laundry operations reached industrial scale. At full occupancy, the resort processed thousands of pounds of linens daily. The laundry facility operated like a factory. Commercial washers, massive dryers, industrial folders. The machinery required dedicated operators, maintenance technicians, and constant supplies. Energy consumption was enormous. Food and beverage operations multiplied exponentially with scale. This resort operated 4 restaurants, 2 bars, a poolside grill, room service, and banquet facilities. Each venue had its own menu, its own kitchen, its own staffing requirements. Coordinating inventory, preventing waste while ensuring availability, maintaining quality standards across venues all demanded sophisticated systems. Purchasing became a specialized function. This property needed dedicated purchasing staff to negotiate contracts, manage vendor relationships, track pricing, and ensure quality standards were met across hundreds of line items. Utilities scaled with physical footprint. The resort covered acres of built space. Every corridor required lighting. Every public area needed climate control. Monthly utility bills ran into 6 figures. Maintenance staff requirements grew with building count. Each wing had its own mechanical systems. The department employed 40 people year-round. Their salaries, tools, vehicles, and materials formed a substantial fixed cost. Security scaled with perimeter and activity. The property's extensive grounds required vehicle patrols. Multiple entry points needed monitoring. A 24/7 security operation with shift supervisors and monitoring stations. The annual security payroll exceeded $500,000. Technology infrastructure became complex and expensive at scale. Each room required internet access, television service, telephone capabilities, and electronic locks. The resort operated its own server farm, employed IT staff, and subscribed to multiple systems. Every system, every department, every operational element existed at a smaller property, but magnified and complicated by scale. The resort couldn't achieve proportional efficiencies because complexity grew faster than size. The scale that was supposed to ensure competitive advantage instead created operational fragility. The resort needed extraordinary revenue to cover ordinary expenses. The problem wasn't empty rooms, it was insufficient fullness. High season delivered. From December through March, occupancy reliably exceeded 80%. The resort filled with guests escaping northern winters. Demand was strong. Rates held at published levels. Restaurants filled. Spa appointments booked solid. During those months, the resort approached profitability. In exceptional weeks, when occupancy reached the high 80s, the resort came tantalizingly close to breaking even. Then high season ended. April brought the first softness. Occupancy dipped to the low 70s. Revenue fell, but fixed costs remained unchanged. May through August presented deeper challenges. Heat and humidity climbed. Hurricane season created uncertainty. Business travel slowed. Occupancy dropped into the 50s. During the worst weeks, the resort operated at 45% capacity. Less than half the rooms generated revenue. The other half sat vacant, still requiring climate control, still contributing nothing toward covering fixed costs. Shoulder months, September through November, offered brief recoveries. Occupancy climbed back to the 60s, but it never sustained. Averaged across the full year, occupancy settled in the mid-60s. Some years reached 68%. Exceptional years touched 71%, but the average hovered around 65%, well below the 78% required to break even. The shortfall was structural, not operational. The resort couldn't control seasonal demand patterns. Market dynamics determined when people traveled. No amount of marketing could eliminate seasonality. The resort tried to manage the shortfall. Revenue management systems adjusted pricing. Discounts appeared during slow periods, attempting to attract price-sensitive guests. The logic was sound. A discounted room generated more revenue than an empty room. But discounting created its own problems. Lower prices didn't fix the math. They accelerated the damage. The revenue management strategy seemed rational. During low occupancy periods, empty rooms represented pure loss. A guest paying $250 for a room, normally priced at $400, still contributed toward covering costs. That was better than zero. The logic held in isolation. But resorts weren't isolated systems. Each occupied room triggered variable costs. Housekeeping supplies, linens, toiletries, energy, hot water, wear on furnishings, and labor. These direct costs averaged $65 per occupied room per night. A room sold for $250 generated $185 in contribution margin after covering its direct costs. But contribution margin wasn't profit. It was the amount available to cover fixed costs. With fixed costs running tens of thousands daily, the resort needed not just contribution margin, but enough of it to cover the entire burden. Discounting undermined this equation in subtle ways. First, it lowered the average daily rate across all occupied rooms. Even if only 30% of rooms sold at discount, the blended average dropped. Second, discounted guests spent less on ancillary services. Guests paying full rates tended to spend freely on dining and spa treatments. Guests arriving on discounted rates were more price-conscious. They ate off-property and minimized incidental spending. Per-room ancillary revenue from discounted bookings averaged $40, roughly half the $75 target needed. Third, discounting attracted guests who generated disproportionate service costs. Price-sensitive travelers were more likely to complain, request upgrades, and demand exceptions. The operational cost of a discounted guest often exceeded the cost of a full-rate guest, even though the revenue was lower. Fourth, discounts trained the market to expect deals. Once guests learned they could book at 30% off by waiting, fewer booked at published rates. Restoring rates after discounting proved nearly impossible. The resort's discounting followed seasonal patterns. May through August saw rates drop 25 to 40% below high season levels. The offers filled rooms. Occupancy during these months rose from the low 50s to the mid-60s, but the revenue impact was negative. A May with 65% occupancy at $245 average daily rate generated less total room revenue than a May with 55% occupancy at $350. The resort was trapped. Maintaining higher rates during low season meant accepting lower occupancy. Discounting improved occupancy, but eroded revenue and trained guests to expect low prices. Neither approach closed the gap to break even. Third-party booking platforms complicated the problem. Sites like Expedia took 15–25% commissions. A room booked through a platform at $300 netted the resort $225 to $250. The platforms also controlled customer relationships. The resort needed the volume platforms provided, but the economics were punishing. The resort's actual average daily rate across the full year was $298, 23% below the break-even target. At 65% average occupancy, the resort was simultaneously underoccupied and underpriced. Discounting improved occupancy marginally, but made the rate problem worse. Even its best months weren't enough. December through March represented the resort's annual opportunity. Demand was strong. Weather was perfect. The resort could command premium rates and still achieve occupancy in the 80s. During these months, the resort generated its strongest revenue. January alone sometimes produced 18% of annual room revenue. The combination of high rates and high occupancy created what should have been substantial profit. The resort's January performance typically reached 85% occupancy at an average daily rate of $420. Total room revenue approached $4.6 million. Ancillary revenue added another $1.2 million. Total January revenue averaged $5.8 million. But costs were equally large. Variable costs during high occupancy increased significantly. Housekeeping supplies, laundry, food costs, utilities, and hourly labor all scaled with activity. The resort hired seasonal staff to handle peak demand, adding payroll expense. Variable costs during January averaged $1.8 million combined with fixed costs allocated monthly at $2.3 million. Total January costs reached $4.1 million. That left $1.7 million in monthly operating profit. February and March produced similar results. Across the 4 peak months, the resort generated approximately $6 million in cumulative operating profit. That sounds like success. But the resort operated 12 months annually. The remaining 8 months produced consistent losses. April's occupancy dropped to 68% and rates softened to $340. Monthly revenue fell to $3.9 million. April generated a $400,000 operating loss. May through August were disasters. Occupancy averaged 52%. Rates collapsed to $245. Monthly revenue struggled to reach $2.8 million, while costs held near $3.7 million. Each month lost $900,000. Across the 4 summer months, losses accumulated to $3.6 million. September through November improved to break even or marginal profit. The annual operating results told a clear story. 4 strong months generated $6 million in profit. 8 weak months generated $5 million in losses. The net annual operating profit was approximately $1 million. That figure was deceiving. Operating profit didn't include debt service, which consumed $4.2 million annually. It didn't include capital expenditures required to maintain the property, which averaged $1.8 million. After accounting for these necessary expenses, the resort posted an annual net loss of $5 million. Peak season success couldn't overcome structural shortfalls. The resort needed either year-round high performance or peak months so profitable they could subsidize the entire year. It achieved neither. Luxury does not degrade gracefully. A budget motel could defer maintenance for years before guests noticed. But guests paying $425 expected perfection. A single cracked tile, a stain on upholstery, a malfunctioning light fixture, any imperfection became evidence of decline. The resort couldn't defer anything. Maintenance was continuous, expensive, and non-negotiable. Paint required refreshing every 3 years. Ocean air and sun degraded exterior finishes faster than inland climates. Repainting was a major project requiring scaffolding and skilled contractors. The cost ran into 6 figures. Carpeting in corridors wore from traffic. High-quality commercial carpet lasted approximately 7 years before replacement became necessary. Each replacement cycle cost $800,000. Guest room furnishings degraded from use. Mattresses required replacement every 5 years. Upholstered furniture faded and stained. Each room's furnishings cost approximately $12,000 to replace fully. With 427 rooms on staggered replacement cycles, the resort spent $1 million annually on in-room furnishings. Linens wore out. High thread count sheets and premium towels lasted approximately 200 wash cycles. At full occupancy, the resort cycled through its entire linen inventory every 8 months. Replacements cost $450,000 annually. Mechanical systems demanded ongoing attention. HVAC units serving individual rooms required seasonal servicing. The 427 units generated 427 service appointments annually. Complete unit replacements averaged 30 per year at $3,500 each. The central plant that provided chilled water to the entire resort required major overhauls every decade. Annual plant maintenance costs exceeded $200,000. Plumbing systems aged invisibly. The resort's distributed hot water systems required constant vigilance. Preventive maintenance was cheaper than emergency repairs, but still expensive. Annual plumbing costs averaged $175,000. Roofing on a coastal property faced constant assault from wind, rain, salt spray, and sun. Inspections were quarterly. Repairs were constant. Full replacement, necessary every 15 to 20 years, would cost $3 million. Landscaping was never-ending. Palms required trimming and fertilizing. Flowering plants rotated seasonally. Irrigation systems needed repairs. The grounds crew worked year-round at an annual cost exceeding $400,000. Pool systems were complex and temperamental. Pumps, filters, heaters, chemical feeders all required maintenance. Between resurfacing cycles, ongoing repairs averaged $150,000 annually. Technology infrastructure needed constant updates. Property management systems required software upgrades. In-room televisions became obsolete. Wi-Fi systems needed capacity upgrades. The resort's IT budget was $300,000 annually and growing. Regulatory compliance added mandatory expenses. Fire suppression systems required annual inspections. Elevators needed certified inspections. Health department standards mandated kitchen equipment maintenance. Non-compliance risked fines or closures. The combined annual maintenance budget was $4.8 million. Capital expenditures ran separately. The resort's capital budget averaged $1.8 million annually. Every dollar spent on maintenance was necessary, but none of it generated revenue. The resort had to spend millions annually just to remain the resort. Guests didn't pay more because fresh paint appeared. They expected fresh paint, so the resort paid. It painted. It replaced. It repaired. Every year. And the expense pushed break-even even further out of reach. Being close to break-even was the most dangerous state. Numbers told a story that appeared hopeful. The resort's best years showed annual operating profits of $1.2 million. Management could point to positive cash flow from operations. They could demonstrate improving trends, better occupancy, stronger rates. Presentations to ownership highlighted progress. Occupancy climbed from 63% to 65% to 67%. Average daily rate increased from $285 to $298 to $312. Guest satisfaction scores improved. The resort was performing better. The narrative was accurate. The resort was improving, but improving toward an impossible target. Occupancy would need to jump from 67% to 78%. Average daily rate would need to rise from $312 to $385, both simultaneously, and sustain that performance indefinitely. The gap appeared closable. 11 percentage points of occupancy, $73 of average rate. With strong marketing, those numbers seemed achievable. They weren't. The gap represented structural barriers, not operational shortfalls. Occupancy was constrained by seasonal demand. No amount of marketing could eliminate the fact that fewer people wanted beach vacations in August heat. The market size during low season was simply smaller. Average rate was constrained by competitive dynamics. Other resorts in the market set pricing boundaries. Premium positioning worked during high season. During soft seasons, rate premiums evaporated. Attempting to hold rates meant accepting lower occupancy. The almost profitable illusion was dangerous because it justified continued operation. Ownership saw progress. Management believed break-even was achievable with one more strong year. Everyone had incentives to believe the resort was trending toward sustainability. It wasn't. It was treading water while slowly exhausting reserves. The annual losses, after debt service and capital expenditures, averaged $5 million. That money came from somewhere, initially from ownership capital, later from refinancing, eventually from deferred maintenance, but the numbers showed almost profitable. Operating income was positive. Trends were improving. One more strong season, and break-even seemed within reach. This psychological trap kept the resort operating years longer than pure financial analysis would justify. Because giving up when you're almost there feels like failure. Admitting that close isn't good enough requires acknowledging that the entire premise was flawed. That admission carried consequences no one wanted to face. So the resort continued, improving incrementally, losing millions annually, sustained not by business logic but by hope. At some point, revenue stopped mattering. The resort's annual cash flow statement revealed the transformation. Operating revenue minus operating expenses produced operating income. That figure was positive, averaging $1.1 million annually. But operating income wasn't cash available for owners. Debt service took $4.2 million, capital expenditures required $1.8 million, total cash needed was $6 million, operating income covered 18%. The remaining $4.9 million had to come from somewhere. Initially, it came from contributed capital. Ownership had reserved funds for working capital. New resorts typically required years to reach stabilization. Losses were expected. Year 1, $6.2 million loss. Covered. Year 2, $5.8 million loss. Covered. Year 3, $5.3 million loss. Covered. But ownership began asking when losses would end. Year 4, $4.9 million loss. Year 5, $5.1 million loss. By year 6, ownership's appetite for continued subsidy was exhausted. But the resort couldn't be sold profitably. Market values for resort properties were based on cash flow multiples. Negative cash flow produced negative valuations. The alternative was refinancing. A new loan closed in year 7 for $68 million, up from the original $52 million construction loan. The additional $16 million paid off, accumulated unpaid interest, and provided working capital to cover projected losses for 3 more years. Debt service increased. The new loan's annual payment was $5.4 million, but ownership's capital contributions stopped. The refinancing had bought time by converting anticipated future cash flow into present debt. The problem was the future cash flow didn't materialize. The resort's operations didn't improve enough to cover the higher debt service. Losses continued at $5+ million annually. So, refinancing proceeds depleted within 3 years. Year 10 brought another crisis. Another refinancing barely closed. Terms were less favorable. The interest rate was higher. The loan provided enough to cover 2 more years of losses. At this point, the resort was operationally irrelevant. It didn't matter if occupancy was 65% or 70%. The operating results couldn't possibly cover the debt service. The resort existed in financial limbo, sustained by lenders' willingness to extend and pretend rather than force a default that would crystallize their own losses. Accounting became creative. Depreciation schedules were extended. Deferred maintenance was capitalized rather than expensed. The financial statements showed improving performance, even as the underlying economics remained unchanged. Management focused on metrics that could show progress. Guest satisfaction scores were high. Occupancy trends were positive. All true, all irrelevant to the fundamental problem that the resort couldn't generate sufficient cash to service its debt. The operation became performative. The resort had to look successful to maintain lender confidence. Staff maintained standards. Marketing continued. But the financial reality was a structure sustained entirely by the willingness of capital providers to continue feeding cash into an operation that would never return it. Eventually, profitability became theoretical. The financial statements told a story increasingly disconnected from economic truth. The balance sheet listed assets, land, buildings, furniture, fixtures, equipment. The valuations reflected historical cost less accumulated depreciation. By this accounting, the resort was worth $94 million. Market reality suggested otherwise. A distressed sale would liquidate assets for far less. The land retained value, perhaps $15 million. The buildings, designed for a specific purpose and expensive to operate, had limited alternative use. A realistic market value was perhaps $30 million, well below the $71 million debt balance. But accounting didn't require market value assessment unless impairment was triggered. Management tested for impairment annually, projecting future cash flows. The projections assumed occupancy would reach 75% within 3 years and 78% within 5. These assumptions, while optimistic, weren't provably impossible. No impairment was recognized. Revenue recognition policies were optimized within allowable bounds. Breakage on gift certificates was recognized earlier. Points in the loyalty program were valued more conservatively. None of this violated accounting standards. All of it improved reported revenue. Expense capitalization was applied aggressively. Costs that could arguably extend asset life were capitalized rather than expensed. A roof repair that in prior years would have been maintenance expense became a capital improvement. Depreciation lives were extended. Furniture originally depreciated over 7 years was reassessed and changed to 10 years. The change reduced annual depreciation expense by $400,000. The cash impact was zero. The accounting impact was a swing from loss to near break-even in operating income. These adjustments created financial statements that showed improving performance. Net loss narrowed. Lenders reviewing covenants saw compliance. Ownership saw progress. But the cash position told the truth. Cash from operations remained negative. Borrowing continued. Payables stretched to preserve liquidity. The resort employed a full-time financial controller whose primary job had become managing cash flow and lender reporting. Vendor payments were prioritized. Critical services first, discretionary last. Payroll was sacrosanct, but suppliers increasingly waited 60, then 90 days for payment. Auditors signed off on the financial statements with clean opinions. The accounting was defensible. The estimates were within reasonable ranges. But anyone reading the cash flow statement carefully would see the underlying reality. Operations consumed cash. Borrowing provided it. The cycle was unsustainable. This wasn't fraud. It was the application of accounting rules that allowed considerable judgment. Management made judgments that cast performance in the most favorable light. Auditors accepted those judgments. Lenders wanted to believe them. The result was a financial reporting system that had become untethered from the resort's actual condition. Experience couldn't solve a structural equation. The resort had cycled through 3 management companies in 12 years. Each arrived with credentials, case studies from successful properties, and confidence that professional expertise would turn performance around. The first operator took over from the development team. They implemented sophisticated revenue management systems, retrained staff, and applied best practices from their portfolio of luxury properties. Year 1 under their management, occupancy rose from 63% to 65%. Average daily rate improved from $285 to $298. Operating income increased from $800,000 to $1.1 million. Progress, but nowhere near break-even. After 3 years of incremental gains that never reached the magnitude needed, ownership terminated the contract. The second operator specialized in distressed properties. Their approach emphasized cost control, operational efficiency, and aggressive sales to group markets. They renegotiated vendor contracts, reduced staffing, and pursued volume business. Their results were mixed. Costs fell by 8%, but revenue fell 6% as rate compression from group business drove away higher-paying leisure travelers. The net impact was marginal improvement. After 2 years, they departed by mutual agreement. The third operator was brought in for their expertise in luxury positioning. Their strategy was to go upscale, renovate key areas, enhance service standards, pursue ultra-premium pricing. The thesis was that 50% occupancy at $500 average rate would outperform 70% occupancy at $300. They invested $4 million in property improvements and launched a marketing campaign targeting high-net-worth travelers. The results were disappointing. Occupancy fell to 58% as expected, but average rate only reached $380, well below the $500 target. The market simply didn't support that level of pricing outside peak season. After 18 months, ownership replaced them. Each operator was competent. Each identified real opportunities. Each implemented changes that produced measurable improvements in specific metrics. But none could overcome the fundamental problem. The resort's break-even occupancy of 78% at $385 average rate was structurally unachievable. The issue wasn't operational, it was mathematical. The resort had been designed with fixed costs that required a level of revenue the market couldn't consistently provide. No amount of revenue management expertise could create demand that didn't exist. No cost-cutting could reduce fixed costs below the level needed to operate. The cycle of operator changes served a purpose for ownership. Each new operator brought hope, justification for continued subsidy, and evidence to lenders that management was taking action. Each transition reset expectations. But the underlying economics never changed. The resort needed 334 occupied rooms nightly at $385 average rate, plus $75 ancillary revenue per room. No operator achieved that, because the market fundamentals made it impossible. The best operators came closest during peak season. January, under professional management, might reach 87% occupancy at $420 average rate. Excellent performance, but April dropped to 68% and $340. August fell to 52% and $240. The annual average always settled near 65% occupancy and $310 rate. That wasn't operational failure. It was demand reality. The resort needed year-round performance that the location, climate, and competitive set couldn't deliver. Operational excellence could optimize within those constraints. It couldn't transcend them. The resort didn't close. It bled. Year 17. The resort remained operational. Bookings were accepted, rooms were cleaned, meals were served. To a guest arriving for a week's vacation, nothing appeared wrong. Behind the scenes, the financial situation had deteriorated beyond traditional business metrics. The resort operated in zombie status, neither alive in the sense of being sustainably profitable, nor dead in the sense of being closed. The current lender, the third since opening, had worked out an arrangement. Monthly debt service was deferred and added to principal. Interest continued accruing. The loan balance grew steadily. The lender's internal models showed the property as a non-performing asset, but foreclosure would crystallize a loss larger than continued forbearance. Ownership had effectively abandoned hope of recovering their investment. The original development equity of $32 million was gone. Subsequent capital, contributions of $14 million, had also been lost. Current ownership involvement was limited to defending against foreclosure. The management company operated under a contract structure where they earned fees based on revenue, not profit. As long as the resort stayed open, they collected management fees. Their incentive was operational continuity, not financial sustainability. Staff turnover was high but not catastrophic. Hourly wages were slightly below market, but the work was steady. Many employees understood the resort's tenuous situation but needed the jobs. The local economy offered limited alternatives. Vendors adapted to slow payments. Key suppliers continued on the basis that partial payment eventually was better than no payment from a bankrupt customer. Discretionary vendors had largely withdrawn. The property showed wear. Deferred maintenance had accumulated. Paint was overdue for refresh. Carpet in corridors was thin. Some rooms had visible issues that housekeeping couldn't remedy without capital investment. Online reviews mentioned these details. Ratings slipped from 4.2 to 3.9 stars. Occupancy held around 60%. Marketing budgets had been cut, reducing visibility. The resort relied increasingly on third-party booking platforms that took heavy commissions. Direct bookings had declined. Repeat guests were rare. Average daily rate had compressed to $275, far below the $385 needed for break-even. Special offers ran constantly. The resort competed primarily on price, having lost the ability to command premium rates as condition deteriorated. Annual losses stabilized around $6 million. Operating income had fallen to $400,000. Debt service, now including deferred payments, was $6.4 million. Capital expenditures had been cut to $800,000, covering only emergency repairs. The deficit was entirely funded by the lender through forbearance. This could continue for years. The lender's tolerance for carrying the non-performing loan was substantial. As long as the resort stayed open and maintained minimal standards, foreclosure remained a worse option. Staff served guests who had no idea the resort was insolvent. The vacation experience was adequate, not exceptional, but acceptable. Travelers looking for beach access at discounted rates found value. This was operational failure without operational collapse. The resort functioned while being fundamentally unsustainable. It employed people, housed guests, generated economic activity, all while consuming capital that would never be repaid. The resort remained open, still losing money every single day. Iconic resorts fail quietly all the time. This property wasn't unique. Across coastal markets, ski destinations, and luxury locations, similar stories played out with predictable rhythm. Large-scale resort developments conceived during boom times, financed with optimistic projections, opened with fanfare, then struggled to reach the occupancy and rates needed to service the debt and maintain the property. A resort in the Caribbean, 400 rooms, opened with private equity backing, Projected break-even at 72% occupancy, never exceeded 65%, refinanced twice, currently in its 12th year of operation and 9th year of losses. Still open, still marketing, still booking guests while being effectively insolvent. A ski resort in the Rockies, 350 rooms, developed during a real estate boom when land prices and construction costs were peak. Built to luxury specifications that required premium rates to justify. But the market already had established luxury competitors with lower cost bases. The new resort couldn't compete without discounting, which made profitability impossible. Currently owned by the lender after a foreclosure that occurred only on paper. Operations continue under lender control. A beach resort in Mexico. 500 rooms. Built by a hotel chain as a flagship property. Designed to be the premier luxury destination in the region. Opened during a global recession. Never reached projected occupancy. Parent company supported it for 8 years before selling at a massive loss to a distressed asset buyer. The buyer operates it as a mid-market property at rates 40% below original projections. It reaches break-even in this diminished state, but the original investment was completely lost. The pattern repeats because the incentives that create these resorts are disconnected from the economics that sustain them. Developers are rewarded for completing projects. Construction lenders earn fees on disbursements. Initial investors can exit through refinancing before losses materialize. Management companies earn fees based on revenue. Everyone in the development chain benefits from the project moving forward, even if the finished product is structurally unprofitable. Due diligence during development focuses on construction feasibility, permitting, market studies that project demand, and financing structures. But market studies are frequently optimistic. They identify potential demand without adequately accounting for competitive response, seasonal variation, and the difference between peak performance and average annual performance. A study might show that the market can support X rooms at Y average rate based on current occupancy levels at existing hotels. But when the new resort opens, it doesn't add to total market demand. It redistributes existing demand. Competitors respond by discounting. Market-wide average rates fall. The new resort captures share, but at lower rates than projected. The net result is industry-wide pressure on profitability. Lenders rely on appraisals that assume stabilized performance. The appraisal projects that after a ramp-up period, the resort will reach 75% occupancy at rates consistent with competitive luxury properties. These projections go into underwriting models that approve loans. But the projections often don't materialize because they assume the market will accommodate another luxury product without significant disruption to pricing. Once operational, resorts rarely close voluntarily. The stigma of closure is severe. A closed resort signals failure, which impairs any hope of recovery. Better to remain open, even at a loss, preserving optionality for eventual sale or market recovery. Lenders prefer properties to stay open because operating resorts are easier to market than closed ones. The physical plant deteriorates faster when vacant. Staff disperse and can't be reassembled easily. The result is an industry with numerous properties operating below, break even for extended periods. They're sustained by forbearance, by owners willing to subsidize losses in hopes of eventual recovery, by lenders unable to force resolution without crystallizing massive losses, and by management companies content to collect fees on revenue without responsibility for profitability. This creates a strange competitive dynamic. Well-operated, profitable resorts compete against insolvent ones that can afford to discount, because they're not concerned with covering true costs. The presence of zombie resorts suppresses market rates, making it harder for healthy properties to maintain pricing discipline. Industry conferences avoid discussing this. Panels focus on revenue management techniques, guest experience innovation, and sustainability initiatives. The uncomfortable truth that many iconic properties operate at structural losses is rarely addressed publicly. It's bad for business. It discourages investment. It reveals vulnerabilities no one wants to acknowledge. But privately, industry veterans understand. They can identify which properties are genuinely profitable versus which are operationally functional but financially underwater. They see the patterns: frequent operator changes, deferred maintenance, aggressive discounting, ownership transitions, refinancings that increase debt rather than reduce it. The question isn't whether these properties can survive indefinitely. They can as long as capital providers continue forbearance. The question is what they represent. Are they businesses or simply artifacts sustained past their economic viability by parties with no better options? And whether the answer to that question matters to anyone beyond the capital providers absorbing the losses. Profitability was assumed, not engineered. Go back to the beginning, before construction, before financing, to the initial concept. The developers looked at the market and saw opportunity. Existing resorts were aging. Demand was growing. A new property with modern amenities and luxury positioning could capture premium rates. The location was ideal. The market study confirmed demand. The pro forma showed profitability within year 4. The pro forma was the problem. It was built on assumptions that seemed reasonable in isolation, but became impossible in aggregate. It assumed 72% average annual occupancy. It assumed $365 average daily rate. It assumed 60% margins on food and beverage. It assumed operating costs at 58% of revenue. All of these were based on industry benchmarks, but industry benchmarks represented averages across profitable and unprofitable properties, across different markets with different cost structures, across established resorts with paid-off debt, and new properties carrying heavy financing costs. Applying generic benchmarks to a specific property in a specific market with specific debt service requirements was a category error. The resort's actual break-even occupancy of 78% was never calculated during development. It emerged only after opening, when actual fixed costs were known, when debt service was finalized, when capital expenditure requirements became clear. By then, the resort existed. Acknowledging that break-even was structurally unachievable would have meant admitting the entire development was a mistake. The design decisions that created the problem seemed logical individually. 427 rooms provided scale. Multiple restaurants offered variety. The spa differentiated the property. Extensive grounds created ambiance. Each decision made sense from a competitive positioning standpoint. Together, they created a cost structure that required revenue the market couldn't consistently provide. No one explicitly designed the resort to fail, but no one explicitly designed it to break even either. Profitability was assumed as the natural result of building something beautiful and marketing it well. The financial modeling was superficial, focused on whether the project met return hurdles for investors, not whether the operating business could sustain itself. This wasn't fraud or incompetence. It was optimism meeting complexity. Resort development involves hundreds of decisions made by different parties. Architects maximizing aesthetic impact, contractors minimizing construction difficulty, lenders protecting their interests through conservative loan structures that increased debt service, operators pushing for amenities that would ease marketing, investors seeking the highest rates of return. Each party optimized for their own objectives. No one was responsible for the integrated question: can this specific resort, in this specific market, with this specific cost structure, generate sufficient revenue to cover its costs and service its debt? That question should have been answered before groundbreaking. It wasn't, or rather, it was answered with projections that looked plausible but proved unrealistic. The market study showed demand for X rooms. The pro forma showed profitability at Y occupancy. The lender approved based on appraised value assuming Z performance. All the numbers worked on paper. They didn't work in reality. because reality included factors the models missed. Seasonal demand variation was smoothed in annual averages. Competitive response was underestimated. The discount required to fill rooms during shoulder season was more severe than projected. Operating costs increased faster than revenue as scale created complexity. Capital expenditure requirements to maintain luxury standards were higher than generic industry assumptions. By the time these realities became clear, the resort was open, debt was issued, investors were committed, and hundreds of people depended on the property for employment. Closing would crystallize losses that remaining open could postpone. So it stayed open, operating professionally while being structurally unprofitable. The resort was never designed to break even because the designers never calculated what break even actually required. They designed for competitive excellence, aesthetic impact, and projected returns. Whether the finished product could function as a sustainable business was assumed rather than proven. And that assumption, made by intelligent people working with industry-standard methodologies and reasonable projections, created a resort that operates flawlessly while losing money every single day. Ending the sunsets, the pool lights activate on their timers. Staff begin turn-down service in occupied rooms. The restaurant hostess greets guests arriving for dinner reservations. Everything functions. Every system operates as designed. The resort delivers exactly the experience it promises. In the accounting office, the monthly close is underway. Revenue is tallied. Expenses are recorded. The deficit is calculated, added to the accumulated total, and forwarded to ownership and lenders. The numbers tell the same story they've told every month for years. Operations are professional. Financial performance is unsustainable. This wasn't incompetence. It wasn't corruption. It wasn't neglect. It was structural unprofitability, built into the property's foundation as surely as the concrete and steel. When scale outpaces demand, when fixed costs exceed revenue potential, when break-even sits beyond any achievable occupancy, the business model becomes impossible regardless of operational excellence. Some resorts don't fail. They simply operate until the math can't be ignored anymore. The resort remains open tonight. Guests sleep soundly. Staff clock out after their shifts. Bookings are accepted for next month, next quarter, next year, and every single day it loses money.